Alright, so today we're going to be looking at Jean Baudrillard's 1983 work, Fatal Strategies. We'll be taking a look here at chapter 1 called Ecstasy and Inertia, where he's going to lay out his project of defining exactly what fatal strategies are. Jean Baudrillard is a very eclectic thinker. He's the girl that you don't want to bring home to mom and dad, so to speak. He flirts with a lot of very provocative themes like terrorism, post-humanism, even like atomic bombs and things like that. And of course, he's responding to these to various degrees. But the point to be made is Jean Baudrillard is worried about a problem that Deleuze and Guattari are worried about, Foucault is worried about, Marx is worried about, and really Marx kind of lays this out at first, is for Marx, building off of Hegel, history is dialectical. It is two contradictory or multiple contradictory moments sublating and being reconciled with one another and propelling history via reason. So there will be these contradictions and history won't be able to help itself. It will simply have these moments of radical change, and these will kind of be various eras in history. So capitalism is part of the necessary conditions for what Marx sees as the historical development to communism and to this, utopian kind of world order. But a lot of the subsequent theorists who distance themselves from Marx to varying degrees point out a problem, which is that, okay, we've got all this heightened awareness of our exploitation and whatnot, and all these socialist movements and whatnot are making themselves known throughout the world, but nothing happens. Communism teeters, and now we're in this sort of neoliberal, quasi-laissez-faire capitalist situation where the world is basically dominated by two hegemons, the US and China. And there are some pervasive forces which have essentially, Foucault talks about disciplinary societies, Deleuze talks about control societies, that in a sense, the idea of society has been co-opted with or by power, and has made it such that, in a certain sense, the conditions which we are within that we like to complain about are our fault, at least in part. That we allow ourselves, for example, to have our personal information gladly given to corporations and used as free labor for advertisers on Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat or whatever it may be, or news media, and we have gladly entered into this simulacrum. And Baudrillard wants to point out that this idea of history as perfectly causal and rationally based is always a post hoc thing. Baudrillard says the world is not dialectical. It is sworn to extremes, not to equilibrium. Sworn to radical antagonism, not to reconciliation or synthesis. This is also the principle of evil, as expressed in the quote-unquote evil genie of the object, in the ecstatic form of the pure object and in its strategy victorious over that of the subject. So Baudrillard is pointing out that history doesn't work via this naive synthesis of history moving forward in this grand narrative. No. And it's not perpetuated by individual rational subjects, like we would assume in like the social contract theory, for example, where we all willingly engage in this social contract and we willingly submit to laws which we willfully submitted to. Instead, we have a situation where we have radical antagonisms ruling our lives, pushing us down various paths, and it becomes a question less of rational subjects than objects caught in this delirium. And Baudrillard's response to this is that we will fight obscenity with its own weapons. He says, to the truer than true, we will oppose the falser than false. We will not oppose the beautiful to the ugly, but will look for the uglier than ugly, the monstrous. We will not oppose the visible to the hidden, but will look for the more hidden than hidden, the secret. So Baudrillard is not conservative here. He's not trying to ask us to go back to some, order where things were causal and actions had consequences and all this. No. He is pointing out that the way the world works has obviously changed. And in a sense, the situation has become more fatal, more confusing. But one of Baudrillard's most important contributions is that, in a way, the model of society that we operate in, and he talks about this in Symbolic Exchange and Death, it has antagonism coded into it. That opposition or revolution is in some sense coded by the simulacrum, by the dominant apparatus, by a system that knows that antagonism is now the motor of not history, but ahistory, in the sense of ahistorical, non-historical. And as a result, antagonism often works exactly to perpetuate the system. And thus, Baudrillard's response is to look for these uncoded responses or these uncodable responses. Those responses which can't just be enveloped. And certainly this idea of enveloping, it is a very apparent phenomenon today that your vote really doesn't matter. That especially in U.S. politics, for example, we are basically dominated by a two-party system which allows for a situation where elites can basically co-opt this party system to basically reverberate the same right-wing or at the very least centrist ideas. The leftism of the early 20th century is not at all present in U.S. politics. And Baudrillard's response to this is not to be more radical by being more uncodable. In a sense, he wants to look at what has been coded, what is considered true in a society, what is considered false, what is considered beautiful or ugly. And he wants to co-opt this and basically extenuate the idea of the monstrous or the secret. And this is something that we see in, for example, the Marquis de Sade, who is using rape and torture and infanticide and gruesome acts to basically poke fun at the naivete of moral philosophy. And Baudrillard is going to use this to take him to a lot of different places where he says, for example, but against the acceleration of networks and circuits, we will also look for slowness. Not the nostalgic slowness of the mind, but insoluble immobility. The slower than slow, inertia and silence. Inertia insoluble by effort. Silence insoluble by dialogue. And he sees this as an effect that is wrought throughout modern society, is Sure, speed is important. I'm pretty sure Baudrillard famously responded to Paul Virilio and said that speed is not in style, or speed is not, basically going against Virilio's idea of just absolute speed. Because Baudrillard is bound to these extremes, or he wants to focus on these extremes, I should say. He wants to focus also on the idea of absolute immobility. What happens at these absolute limits of the system? And how is this a coded inevitability of the system? And thus also something which can be taken advantage of. So we see some similarities to Marx, where Marx is like, look, capitalism, all the stuff that it has given us, the prosperity it has given us in terms of material conditions, this is the ground floor for the outgrowth of communism. It's necessary, and we can use this inevitability to our advantage. But Baudrillard takes a little bit less of a utopian kind of angle at this. And instead of using the system's weapons to get to some utopian or greater system, it's almost a Nietzschean sort of destruction of the tablets of values. It's using destruction as our sense of agency. And he wants to focus on this idea of the ecstasy of the model that occurs when we take it to these extremes. He says the ecstatic is an immoral form, while the aesthetic form always implies the moral distinction between the beautiful and the ugly. And he goes on to say a little bit later, that ecstatic destiny which tears things away from their subjective quality and leaves them to the sole attraction of the redoubled trait, of the redoubled definition that tears them away from their quote-unquote objective causes and surrenders them to the sole power of their unleashed effects. So he's trying to go for this this pure ecstasy of, okay, if we are bound to these extremes, then instead of trying to make this distinction between beautiful and ugly and bind ourselves to making things absolute beautiful or feigning the ugly, and also instead of just valorizing the ugly, he wants to valorize the extremes as such, to leave us to the sole power of surpassing external limits. He says, imagine a thing of beauty that has absorbed all the energy of the ugly. That's fashion. Imagine the true that has absorbed all the energy of the false. There you have simulation. And the point for Baudrillard is that the metaphysical question of the true versus false is not a helpful one for him. Instead, he wants to focus on the centrality of symbolic effects, of, really we could say, the sorts of becomings that it is involved with, and also the duplication that it's involved with. Because one of Baudrillard's biggest problems he sees is life in a simulation or a simulacrum, this sort of a closed-in box, you can think of it as, where things just bounce around. But it's almost worse for Baudrillard because it's almost this box in a void that is just moving ad nauseum, and it has no teleology. It has no purpose or place to which it's going. It's merely an internal logic, which is, it's got some very fatal undertones in there. And instead, he wants to uphold within this model seduction, ecstasy, the attraction of challenge, or a fatality of its essence, as he calls it. And he quotes Marie Dorval, "I'm not beautiful, I'm worse." Which is almost like it's a denial of the terms that have been given. But it's not denial by resignation. It's not, you're asked by some hypothetical entity, are you beautiful? And instead of responding, I am not beautiful, I am ugly, I am, I am this extreme caricature, which is something maybe we could see Marquis de Sade as doing. Instead, it's just, I'm worse. It's, I'm the enemy that is inherent to the system, which I am bringing out this logic that was already there. Baudrillard says, ecstasy is the quality proper to any body that spins until all sense is lost and then shines forth in its pure and empty form. He goes on to say, simulation is the ecstasy of the real. Just look at television, where real events follow each other in a perfectly ecstatic relation. That is, in dizzying, stereotyped, unreal, and recurrent ways that allowed a senseless and uninterrupted concatenation. In ecstasy, this is the object in advertising, as is the consumer in contemplation of the advertisement. The spinning of use value and exchange value into annihilation in the pure and empty form of the brand name. And we can think of this, for example, he mentions television, but I also like what Ian Buchanan talks about in his assemblage theory and method, a great secondary resource on Deleuze and Guattari, where he mentions some sociological research and just some commentary on his part in general, which is kind of wondering, how is it that Nike as a brand name can, if you look at the way it produces, it buys pre-produced products from poor countries where the labor is cheap, and then it smacks a logo on it which costs virtually nothing. Virtual is important there. It's basically nothing. The cost in and of itself becomes an unimportant question altogether. And yet Nike, or think about like Gucci or Versace or Ralph Lauren, I don't know any of these companies. The logo in and of itself is this pure spinning of use value and exchange value in this pure and empty form. Pure and empty is important because we can see these are almost two extremes which collapse in on themselves in this pure ecstasy of consumerism, of the ecstasy of being liked, being respected, gladly partaking in the fact that, look, even the rich who buy Gucci and stuff, they know it doesn't cost as much as it does. It doesn't cost that much to produce as it does to purchase it. They know it. But they just don't care that it costs so much more. It's almost the irony or the extremity of the spectacle itself is worth it. And this is something that he's going to push to the limit when he says that we must go to the point of anti-theater. He says anti-theater is the ecstatic form of theater. No more stages or scenes, no more content, but theater in the street, actorless, theater of all for all, which even becomes confused with the regular unfolding of our lives without illusion. Where is the power of illusion if it delights in retracting our daily life and transfiguring our workplace? And in terms of what this anti-theater is, we can think of this as social media. It's the point where the real and the unreal breaks down. Because typically when we think of the real, we think of material things like cups and tables and books and microphones and whatnot. But of course, this is not all that is real. Things like freedom, these pure concepts or ideas, these are real insofar as they prompt historical changes. They prompt the storming of the Bastille, the American Revolution, the 1917 revolution in Russia. So even pure concepts are real insofar as they constitute what a social body is at any one time. Are we oppressed? Are we indignant? Are we satisfied? Are we perplexed? Or are we disenchanted? All of these have to do with, for example, the disenchantment I definitely feel right now kind of in the air around the 2024 election. It's the same thing with Trump or Hillary. No one really wants to vote for either one, but you just vote for one because, well, you don't want the other guy to win. It's being sworn to extremes, which is coded within the theater itself, which breaks down at the point in which, for example, in social media, this distinction between the real and the unreal, it almost becomes coextensive with the life of people themselves. Like, think of Instagram models, for example, whose real life is to be a virtual life. They are one and the same, and this is not something that Baudrillard is critiquing as such. He's not saying it's immoral to be an Instagram model. Get rid of your normative judgments with Baudrillard, really, for all of these postmodern guys. Instead, he's pointing out the fact that these traditional notions of use value or exchange value or agency, who is enacting these changes, it's almost something which springs from the void, in which a system reaches such an optimal state that things seem to, the workplace itself seems to seethe with power relations which have been coded into it. The internet seems to seethe with, think about the way politics interacts with the internet and the way that's involved with some of our most caricature-like events like January 6th. And he points out that this hyperreality, this more real than real, which is something that he wants to valorize. He's not like, oh, the real has collapsed. Oh my gosh, this is terrible. It's not terrible. In fact, for Baudrillard, it is one of the greatest parts about theory is that theory in and of itself becomes a method by which to bring out something which he says transcends itself towards its empty essence. It's this vertigo, this stupefaction, as he calls it, that occurs from this absolute passage to the limit of the system. And he puts this in a funny little almost challenge when he says, imagine a good resplendent with all the power of evil. This is God, a perverse God creating the world on a dare and calling on it to destroy itself. And this is something one always has to keep in mind when they're reading Baudrillard is, he's fatalistic in a sense. He is going to ask us to flirt with themes like terrorism or death. And of course, we could make the rather banal observation that the real terrorists are the CIA. It's like, of course, like, part of the problem is that people can be told rather alarming things about their government, like CIA coups in Central America. But it doesn't really do anything. People are in this state of apathy where nothing is surprising anymore. I remember hearing when I was in 7th grade, we had to watch CNN 10, which was like a 10-minute version of the daily news made by CNN, and they would tell us kind of about what's going on. And all the time, it's talking about like Kim Jong-un and, North Korean military programs. And I remember learning about the hydrogen bomb one day and how North Korea was either developing or had a hydrogen bomb. I'm not exactly too sure. But it's just like the environment that I've grown up in is such that wars, earthquakes, all of these hit us with such intensity. Events from all across the world are concatenated into this media spectacle such that you get kind of sensory adaptation after a while, where you get the stimulus so much that it doesn't really matter anymore. And it's as if at one point there was a moment that was passed in which that apathy really sunk in which people just threw their hands up. Now, Baudrillard draws a rather obscene, almost comical picture. There are plenty of moments in Baudrillard that make you laugh, but not really because they're funny, if that makes sense. They almost make you laugh because of their absurdity, because of this radical fusion of banality and obscenity. He says, more generally, things visible do not come to an end in obscurity and silence. Instead, they fade into the more visible than visible, obscenity. He says something redundant always establishes itself where there is nothing left. And to me, this whole first chapter feels very much like in the Gay Science, when Nietzsche has the story of the death of God, or rather the aphorism in which this is proclaimed. And we have this sort of lament of, like, God is dead, he's been destroyed by modern science, by the fact that people have moved on, such that, Christians today are not the same as they were at, Jesus' time or whatever. There are a myriad of ways to interpret that statement, but he points out this floating in the void, this sort of aimlessness, which seems to be left behind by the death of God. And Nietzsche points out, for example, how this is co-opted by the state in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And the state becomes the new idol. And Baudrillard, in his philosophy of extremes, he's pointing out that in this void, what has to be created is a simulacrum. And what the simulacrum does is it takes the subjectivity of everything and it turns it into a play of objects in which determinacy almost loses its referent. He says determinacy does not disappear in favor of indeterminacy, but of hyperdeterminacy, the redundancy of determinacy in the void. So there's no longer this distinction between inside and outside. No, it's pure events as such. And these redundant events, which occur via coding. Coding in the sense of the activities that one can undergo. For example, and this is kind of it's a liberal in the traditional sense of, liberal. It's really this liberal lie of the social contract, of the polis or the socius gladly partakes in politics. They have consented to these laws. They want these laws. The state, for the most part, does what they want, and every once in a while they have something we can get upset about and we can vote about. And for Baudrillard, Baudrillard zooms out and he says, no, this is naive. He says, in fact, the stuff that we think of as going beyond the system, of taunting the system, in a sense, well, not in a sense, really, that has been expected by the system. It is something which has streamlined and integrated all responses. And thus, he's not worried about getting outside of redundancy. He just wants to turn this redundancy into a caricature. He talks about, he says, finality does not give way to the aleatory, but to a hyperfinality, a hyperfunctionality. And I like that latter one more. He says, more functional than the functional, more final than the final, hypertally. And hypertly, I looked this up because I was like, what is that word? And it comes from biology, and it's basically a hyperadaptation that occurs in an organism. Often this is, for example, coloration, like camouflage, and it's this hyper camouflage that it blurs the distinction between the organism and the environment. And it's really interesting to look at some of these pictures. These bugs grow these strange outgrowths which made their species not last a very long time. But they almost start to grow sticks on them. I mean, it looks so much like a real element of the environment that it's almost adaptation, which makes fun of the utility in adaptation. It's functionality for functionality's sake. It's finality, which results in just this ad nauseum death. And it reminds me of when Deleuze talks about control societies, where the expressive capacities, what is able to make sense in a society, displays basically this caricatured indifference in which we have all these spectacles that we get to look at, but people still really feel like nothing is happening. Baudrillard says, in a system where things are increasingly governed by chance, finality turns into delirium and elements develop that know only too well how to exceed their end until they wind up invading the whole system. So for Baudrillard, this notion of hyperbole, of hyperfunctionality, of pure redundancy, this is a challenge to the traditional notion of causal systems, of finality, of, history is going to move in this rational fashion. He says, look, no, it doesn't anymore. If that had happened, we'd be in our communist utopia. But it doesn't, because the world doesn't work like that. And Baudrillard's response to that is not to say, oh, we failed, we good communists still have a chance. No, he's post-Marxian. And he's saying, okay, something had to be in the system that has allowed for us to get to this point where desire basically works to allow this to come about. This is eerily similar to Deleuze and Guattari, who point out that people weren't duped into tolerating fascism in Germany in the 30s and 40s. In a sense, they were complacent. They wanted this, in a sense. And the question we have to ask is, how did people come to tolerate gassing Jews, for example? Going back to Ian Buchanan and that same work, Assemblage, Theory, and Method, he points out this interesting project that was undergone in Australia to give housing to indigenous peoples in the Northern Territories, which are extremely sparsely populated and extreme hot temperatures, and points out how within this was the notion of what does it even mean to be a house because there was this constant cutting corners of, well, how can we optimize the system, and how can we shift the notion of, can we take heating or cooling out of a house, really cooling in Australia, and it still be a house? Can we mess with the plumbing? And Buchanan points out that this logic of surpassing limits, of testing the limits, that this is something built into the way society works today. It's not a failure, but rather it's, as Baudrillard says, a ghostly escalation of finalities. It's toying with the notion of success or failure in a political sense. And instead, it's really a quite perverse sense of causality, where no matter what happens, it seems like the same people will still be in power. And he points to really a problem that results from continuing to view society in the same ways we have of success versus failure. He says, the hypertrophy of historical research, the frenzy to explain everything, attribute everything, footnote everything, all this becomes a fantastic encumbrance, the references all living off of each other and at each other's expense. An excrescent system of interpretation develops with no relation to its objects. All this comes from a headlong flight forward from the hemorrhage of objective causality. So this is simulation, really. This autonomic, hyper-real discourse, which kind of spins in the void. And look, Baudrillard is not saying, oh, we need to get back to where we have relations with their objects. No. Baudrillard thinks we've passed a point where, as he says, frozen forms proliferate and growth is immobilized in excrescence. This is the form of hyperbole which goes further than its own end. It's really a problem in which we have this obsession with axiomatic proliferation of reason and progressivism, for example. This empty sort of progressivism which does progress for progress's sake without asking, to whom does this progress benefit, with much more finely tuned goggles, because it's easy to be a limp-minded progressive and just look around you and say, oh, power is right there, and I'm not perpetuating it in any way. And in this obsession with this proliferation ad infinitum, we get to this redundancy where we become a coded body. We become a frozen form which proliferates, what Baudrillard will call reproduction in Symbolic Exchange and Death, where our traditional notions of production and anti-production don't really hold anymore. Now we're in a situation where we reproduce a model which we are both an element of and the recipient of. And I love the use of, once again, in Buchanan's work, of TV, where we are, thanks to viewers like you who make this program possible. That's what we're told, that we are the reason it exists and the reason it proliferates. But also, we are beholden to television. We are beholden to the forms which it instantiates and proliferates into us via the advertisement ad nauseum that causes us really to fly headlong, as Baudrillard says, and we respond to this by this kind of subject-object dualism of, oh, well, I'm here and I'm a rational subject and I choose to be here, and there are these objects before me which I can instrumentalize and which I can change things. And Baudrillard is going to, and I'm unsure to what degree he's going to say this, but at the very least, he says that's naive. Maybe in a sense, impossible. There are certainly notions in symbolic exchange and death, for example, when he talks about graffiti movements and he talks about them using these names like a cool killer or something with all caps. He seems to point at moments to these movements which can be seen as uncodable, in which we really can levy this notion of anti-production or contra-production, and we can sort of get out of this vertiginous mess. But at least in this work, he's really not worried about that. He's worried about, okay, we're in this, as he calls it, tentacular, protuberant, excrescent, hypertolic situation of a saturated world. And he basically analogizes this to a cancerous proliferation. Now, I've hinted at this already, but there's this point at which apathy came in, at which the difference in degree is virtually unnoticeable, or not unnoticeable, but doesn't really matter for much. Baudrillard says dead point, and he uses the English dead point there, by the way. It's not a translation. Dead point, the dead center where every system crosses this subtle limit of reversibility, contradiction, and doubt, and enters live into non-contradiction, into its own exalted contemplation, into ecstasy. And really the idea of exalted contemplation, that is something that I think best exemplifies the notion of simulacra and simulation in Baudrillard's work, is that now it's not about contradictions anymore. There's not this clear, here's where the enemy is, and here's where the proletariat is, and we are the class of agency. Instead, it seems that we're in this situation of non-contradiction where no matter what happens in the system, no matter that Trump steals TSSCI clearance documents and, basically puts them out for all of the people coming to Mar-a-Lago to entertain as they please, no matter that things like this happen, it is a event of non-contradiction. It doesn't contradict the system. It seems to just allow for this continued spectacle. And in fact, it seems to be becoming even more dire because, this would be totally unfathomable even 50 years ago. But as these sort of spectacles proliferate, the system is shown in its interiority, its ecstatic interiority, where no matter what happens, it seems like things just don't change. So Baudrillard moves from metaphysics to pataphysics here, where, metaphysics is worried about this idea of reality, and pataphysics is worried about the idea of imaginary solutions. It's kind of the pure discourse of theory. And he points out an interesting thing which happens when we're surpassing these traditional limits of societies. He says, at the point of overcoming of destructive forces, the war scene is over. There's no longer any useful correlation between the potential for annihilation and its objective, so it becomes senseless to employ it. the system dissuades itself, and this is the paradoxically beneficial aspect of dissuasion. There's no more space for war. He says, war, just like the real, will never again take place unless, of course, the nuclear powers succeed in their de-escalation and manage to circumscribe new spaces for war. And I think this is a really good example because, this was written in 1983. This is, about 20 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is when we thought nuclear war was actually possible. And I think Cuban Missile Crisis, this is possibly one of those passages in which we can identify a dead point, so to speak. A crossing into non-contradiction, into pure ecstasy, where we tasted the possibility of nuclear war. And even as we have de-escalated nuclear arms races, even as there has been this global, especially nowadays, even more than in Baudrillard's day, after the fall of the Soviet Union and whatnot, we have this, let's get rid of nuclear arms. And yet, this dissuasion of nuclear arms seems to remain just as prominently as it does in terms of its threat as it did during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So war, in this traditional sense of, merely degrees of destructive potential. Now war is not about degrees of destructive potential. It's degrees of dissuasion. That's really important because in dissuasion, the system dissuades itself. We have this radical interiority, this caricaturing of the system itself, in which redundancy becomes the rule now. War in the traditional sense is gone. He says, in its orbital and ecstatic form, war has become impossible to exchange, and this orbitality protects us. And I think of some of the more funny wars, funny in a perverse sense, of like the Gulf War, which Baudrillard did a piece. The Gulf War did not take place, in which he uses this idea in the same sense where he says war, just like the real, will never again take place unless a course of nuclear powers succeed in their de-escalation and circumscribe these new spaces. That taking place, what is this place of war now? War has entered the virtual space where now war is a product of computers. It is a product of an agency which seems to spring from the void. And thus, the idea of war in the traditional sense is gone because the taking place, that place is so diffuse that it seems to become equiprimordial with society itself. War doesn't really do anything but bounce between poles like the US and China now. And as a result, he says, even supposing we could determine this point, and this point is that dead point, which is a paraphrasing of a quote of Kennedy. Kennedy says, a painful thought, past a certain point in time, history's not been real. And Kennedy's like, where is this point? And Baudrillard's like, this point is non-localizable. It certainly exists. Something changed, but of course we don't know when. He says, Baudrillard, even supposing we could determine this point, what would we do? By what miracle would history become true again? By what miracle could we go back in time to head off its disappearance? For this point is also that of the end of linear time, and all the marvels of science fiction for going back in time are useless if from now on time no longer exists, if beyond us the past has already totally disappeared. And of course one has to be careful, which this to me, like, I think it's so funny, the responses to postmodernists that often occurs in like the natural sciences, where they're like, oh, just all these postmodernists, they don't know what they're talking about. They're using these completely literal, I mean, dumbfounded ideas. And it's like, no, we have to keep in mind the irony, the metaphorical nature of French theory in general, and just critical theory in general. I shouldn't just restrict it to the French. But what Baudrillard is saying here is that going back is really something of a vestige of this notion of reversible time, that we could go back. And Baudrillard points out that this notion of going back, this always seems to be ad hoc. It always seems to be when we're in the thick of things, we've got the older generations and the conservatives going, oh, we should go back to a time when America was great. And we can see this rhetoric being deployed with Donald Trump today. And Baudrillard asks, did we commit some error? Did the human race violate some secret? Did it commit some fatal imprudence? This is sort of like asking what happened. And I think a really useful thing to read alongside this, or an interesting one, would be 3 novellas, What Happened. It's like the 9th plateau of De les Inquateries, 1,000 Plateaus, where they're basically talking about problematizing this notion of what happened or when did it happen, this sort of explosion of acausality. Baudrillard says, quite comically, but I think quite poignantly, it is as useless wondering about that as asking yourself the mysterious reason why a woman has left you. Nothing could have been changed in any event. The terrifying aspect of an event of this kind is that beyond a certain point, all efforts to exorcise it only precipitate it. No foreboding has ever been of any use. Each event makes the one which preceded it completely right. It is thy naivete of imputing every event to causes that makes us think it could have not happened. The pure event without any causes can only unfold uneluctably. On the other hand, it can never be reproduced, whereas a causal process can always be, which is exactly why it is no longer an event. And this is really a notion of a non-reversible, like coded assault that's in plain sight. Because there are always these kind of historical transformations, for lack of a better word, where shit hits the fan, so to speak. And we're wondering, okay, how can we learn from history? How can we do better? How can we learn history so that it doesn't repeat itself? And Baudrillard thinks that this is an ad hoc excuse to precipitate the same model. Baudrillard does not think history is moving towards this notion of progress or utopia like Marx might have in mind, or like some quote-unquote blue-haired liberals, for lack of a better term, might have nowadays. Because Baudrillard is pointing out that nothing could have changed the event because it wasn't strictly something causal. It wasn't just this amassing of material forces in this particular way that allows for history to play out. There is a much broader, much more fatalistic model, that being simulation and simulacra, which is undergirding these historical changes, that is allowing something to take place. We can think of this as the unifying force that makes things make sense. It's what makes 9/11, quote unquote, make sense in US history, in global politics, in Islamism, whatever you want to say. But this notion that we could have changed something, really for him, this is a conservative fever dream. that just precipitates the same system. And the notion that no foreboding has ever been of any use, that each event makes the one which preceded it completely right. Of course, this notion of completely right, we can think of this in the direction of right, as in right-leaning. This is just a wonderful happenstance of translation here. This foreboding, this conservatism of, oh, kids these days, oh, the economy these days, the notion of these days as if it was something causal that one person did or that one institution did, that is sort of a caricature of causal processes, that we couldn't reproduce these historical moments if the material conditions were exactly the same, because it's not the material conditions that are important for Baudrillard. It's these symbolic notions of what is coded, what are the channels in which one can operate, and how is it that these conservative kind of, oh, we could have changed things, and if we just study it harder, and if we look at the material conditions, we could have stopped it. How is it that this plays into the very system? Baudrillard points out that the point he being Canetti, refers to is by definition impossible to find. For if we could grasp it, time would be given back to us. The point from which we could turn the process of the dispersion of time in history around escapes us. That is really why we have crossed it without noticing it, and of course without having wanted to. Obviously these things escape us. Obviously it is precisely the acausality, the ambiguity of key moments in history that makes it where there wasn't one switch that was flipped in which everybody willingly knew that this was the end of history, so to speak. Because Baudrillard heralds the end of history just like other people do. He says, in a sphere foreign to history, history itself can no longer reflect or prove itself. This is why we call on every previous epoch, every way of life, every mentality to historicize itself, to recount itself with proof and documents in hand. Everything becomes documentary. It is because we feel that all this has been invalidated in our own sphere, which is that of the end of history. And I think another really interesting piece to read alongside this would be May 68 Did Not Take Place by Deleuze and Guattari, where they point out this same problem, that this notion that everything has to historicize itself, this is epitomized in May 68, where May 68 did not take place in the same way the Gulf War did not take place. There was no one spot, there was no causal kind of, this was not one homogeneous entity. Deleuze and Guattari point out that that is precisely the power of May 68, is that it sprung forth in this ecstasy of revolution. And this notion that it needs to recount itself, that it needs to be this one historical entity. This is the downfall of revolution, is turning it into a historical process. And by turning it into a historical process, history ceases to be important because we don't learn from history anymore, right? We just learn and then we fall for something new. And we get in this cycle where we can't figure out, okay, why are we always falling for microfascisms, as Deleuze and Guattari put it? Why are we always falling for populist rhetoric that turns into kind of totalitarian ideas? Why do we always fall for willingly giving up our liberties? I mean, think about the fact that we willingly sign the terms and conditions that give private corporations our information. We just don't really care anymore. Now, in response to this point which has been passed, Baudrillard says, perfect is the event or language which assumes its own mode of disappearance, knows how to stage it, and thus reaches the maximal energy of appearances. The catastrophe is the maximal brute event. Here, too, more eventful than the event, but an event without consequences, one that leaves the world in suspense. So this notion of catastrophe, this is one of the fatal strategies. It's a strategy which is part of the system and also its own undoing. It's a staged act that taunts itself, taunts its own conditions, its own architecture, by using the code it's forced to spiral in. It makes a mockery of its own inertia. Baudrillard points out that once the meaning of history is over, once this point of inertia has been passed, every event becomes a catastrophe, becomes an event pure and without consequence. But that is its power. He says, and really this is the essence of fatal strategies for Baudrillard. He says, when light is captured and swallowed by its own source, there is then a brutal involution of time into the event itself. Catastrophe in the literal sense, the inflection or curve that has its origin and end coincided in one, that makes the end return to the origin and annul it, yielding to an event without precedent and without consequences. Pure event. And really, this is obviously the imagery of the black hole. This pure event that turns infinity into a self-mockery. This passage to the limit of, we need to diversify markets as much as possible. We need to expand markets. We need to diffuse markets. We need to maximize utility in the workforce. When infinity becomes our axiomatic, its self-mockery turns into the only possibility for agency, quote unquote. That, at the very center of the black hole, infinity becomes a caricature that just turns into destructive potential. And maybe that's what we need sometimes. I'm very skeptical of Baudrillard sometimes because certainly fatal strategies are obviously fatal. To me, it sometimes seems like Baudrillard is willing to swallow the notion that a system is just perfectly coded, that it's this perfectly shiny, smooth simulacrum. And as a result, he's just going to go for, and I mean, he mentions the body without organs in here, the sort of catatonic, like pure schizo kind of abolition of the subject that just turns into death. But hey, maybe that's a good strategy sometimes. I'm really not sure. And I always kind of like to flirt with Baudrillard as a result. I like to read him and poke in these other thinkers and really accept Baudrillard's challenge. Be like, okay, you want to be radical? This is pretty radical. And he says you cannot go back against the course of time, nor the course of meaning. Baudrillard does not want to go back. He says this in Simulacra and Simulation. It's not about going back. He says we must grasp the catastrophe lying in wait for us in the slowing of light. The slower light is, the less it escapes its source. Things and events have a tendency to no longer allow their meaning to escape, to slow down its emanation, to capture what they formerly refracted and absorb it into a black body. So really, the simulacrum, I mean, it's defined by capture or control in the Deleuzian sense. I mean, we could think of the apparatus of capture too. That would be a great resource to read this alongside with from A Thousand Plateaus, is apparatus of capture. But this capture of the catastrophe operates basically by minimizing the speed and distance of breaks away from this singularity, from this center. It works by basically establishing a center of confluence around which things operate. The government, notions of freedom or progress, institutions that give one something to fall back on, so to speak, kind of these mechanisms that we see as being humane. All this works to basically kind of shovel things in towards the center. And as Baudrillard points out, the slower light is, the less it escapes its source, which, of course, this is metaphorical because light travels at the speed of light. It doesn't change. But this is really the absurdity of capture, which proves itself a fatal and a volatile force that one can take hold of and taunt it and caricature it. Now, one should keep in mind when reading Baudrillard the notion of the last man in Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Nietzsche, which is a properly Baudrillardian aphorism if you read the last man section at the beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where when we think we have mastered death, time, politics, speed, communication, this maximum optimization is basically a maximum moment of spinning in the pure void, of pure redundancy and reduplication. And Baudrillard asks, what if light slowed, dropping to human speeds? What if it bathed us in a slow motion flux of images until it was slower than our own movement? It's this sort of idea of like almost communication leading to catatonia. He says, we would then need to generalize from the case of light reaching us from stars that have long ceased to exist. Their image is still crossing light years to get to us. If light was infinitely slower, a lot of things, even the closest ones, would have already suffered the fate of those stars. We would see them and they'd be there, but they would no longer be there. Wouldn't this be the case for the real itself? Something whose image is still coming to us, but which no longer exists? And this is reality in simulation, or in the simulacrum. It's a copy without an original, right? This is hyperreality, is the copy without an original. It's light from something which has reached such a slowness that when it reaches us, it takes an infinite amount of time for us to realize that the thing that it's duplicating was never there in the first place. He says, or supposing light were very slow, could bodies approach us faster than their image? Then what would happen? They would rub into us without our seeing them coming. And this is really the acausal kind of milieu within which society operates now. It seems like all of this stuff, there's so much information, yet I think of the recent escalation in Gaza, in which it seems like the whole world didn't realize that the situation in Palestine was going on. And it's really quite profound for me. I mean, it reminds me of when I started reading like Edward Said, and I realized kind of the situation going on in the Middle East. And I was like, why don't I know about this? Like, this is a travesty that I don't know about this. But maybe the more cynical Baudrillardian question to ask would be, would things change if I did know about it? Because now, as people know about the Israel-Palestine conflict, nothing matters. Gaza is getting smaller, it's getting poorer, it's getting more desolate, and the whole world is seeming to shout ceasefire, and it just doesn't matter. It's rubbing into us without seeing them coming. And really, I can empathize, and I think many can, with the cynicism of the fact that foreboding hasn't been of any use. That each event makes the one which preceded it completely right. It just seems to follow this sort of elite causality of sorts. And really the problem that ensues from this is that no one feels like they have a voice anymore, right? And I think this is exemplified by Baudrillard saying light like perfume, differing according to the body, scarcely diffusing outside of an immediate environment, a sphere of luminous messages attenuating as they go. The images of the body scarcely propagate beyond a certain luminous territory. Beyond that, it no longer exists. So you as a sort of subject, I think it's really interesting to think of the Foucauldian idea of disciplinary societies and juridical subjects, disciplinary subjects, that this notion of the body, of the autonomous subject, today we live in a situation of kind of hyper-individualism, of each body is differentiated and individual and autonomous, right? And you can do whatever you want. But at that limit, we scarcely diffuse outside of our immediate environment. It's this radical interiority, which I think people can see, for example, with the internet, where you can be infinitely close to someone, and yet you can be as far away from society as possible. Baudrillard says, can one imagine a slow refraction of faces and gestures, like the movements of swimmers in heavy water? How do you look someone in the eyes? How do you seduce him if you are not sure he's still there? What if a cinematic slow motion took control of the whole universe? A comical exaltation of the accelerated, which transcends sense by explosion, but also the poetic enchantment of slow motion, which destroys sense by implosion. That is fatal strategy. It is comic exaltation of the passage to the extremes. It is transcending the notion of what makes sense by exploding the very code that one operates using. It is an enchantment of not only speed, but also slowness. This infinite slowness where, light seems to diffuse and just attenuate out of the body rather quickly, such that we get this isolated individualism. The ultimate definition of fatal strategies, this is on page 39, by the way, of the semiotext edition, is that fatal strategies are, quote, that which so suspends the development of the form that the meaning no longer crystallizes. Or else, beneath the discourse of meaning, another flows slowly and implodes under it. So slow that it could curl up on itself and even stop totally in its progression. Light could lead to a total suspension of the universe. So this is really, it's asking us to wield these cosmic forces of light captured and swallowed up and inflected in on itself of the black hole. It's okay, if we have these forces that are engineering us in certain ways, Baudrillard's response is not to escape those forces. I mean, think about trying to escape the black hole once you've gone beyond the event horizon, that point at which light does not escape. The speed of nothing is not enough to counteract it. It doesn't matter anymore. Meaning no longer crystallizes, but this is the essence of these fatal strategies. It's a meaning of implosion, of catastrophe itself, which, it has some fatal consequences, but it's certainly a very seductive strategy, I'll say that. Now we can see in a quite derided kind of example, Baudrillard points out that catastrophes take on the form of their culture. And he speaks of how cities are defined by catastrophes, like King Kong, obviously fictional, but it grows to define New York. The towering inferno is what he calls it. He speaks of Los Angeles as being defined by earthquakes and faults, for example. And I think maybe that's a little bit of a foreign... I've lived in the U.S. my whole life, and that's not really what Los Angeles, or really California, has been known for in my day, but it is what it is. His point is still interesting. He says, this is a form that today is more proximal and evocative, on the order of fission and instantaneous propagation, undulatory, spasmodic, and brutal communication. The sky no longer falls on you from on high. Instead, whole territories slide away. We are in a fissile universe of wandering ice flows and horizontal drifts. Interstitial collapse. That is the seismic effect, mental too, that waits in ambush for us. The dehiscence of the things most firmly attached, the trembling of things tightening and contracting over their emptiness. For the bottom, the ground never existed, only a cracked epidermis. Nor were there any depths, which we now know are in fusion. Seisms tell us as much. They are a requiem for the infrastructure. We are no longer waiting for the stars or the heavens, but for the subterranean gods who threaten us with a collapse into emptiness. We dream of capturing that energy too, but that is pure madness. We might as well hope to capture the energy of automobile accidents, of dogs that have been run over, or of anything that collapses. New hypothesis. If things have a greater tendency to disappear and collapse, perhaps the principal source of future energy will be accident and catastrophe. And really, that notion of capturing the energy of automobile accidents or dogs having been run over, that exemplifies the sort of caricature that he's leveling here. It's an attack on significatory infrastructure via its most obscene agents and its afterthoughts. It's finding those cracks in, he calls them seisms, kind of a play on seismic. These seisms, these cracks that we see as the deficiency of the system, they are a requiem for the infrastructure. They are the means by which it subsists, the means by which this whole amphitheater, which has collapsed in on itself, functions. And thus, we shouldn't try to capture this energy because, well, really that's, even the system itself captures with the point in mind of escaping any axiomatic, any sense of use value or what makes sense or what is owed. It's always being outstripped. It's always being taken to a new extreme. So Baudrillard doesn't want us to not collapse. He doesn't want us to capture, but he wants us to take advantage of the system's fatalist logic. He wants us to focus on the secret, the accident, the catastrophe, the symbolic energy of rupture, as he calls it. And that is really what is being captured by the system, he says. That symbolic energy of rupture. And it's not being captured to be annulled, but to be weaponized, to be taken advantage of. I mean, think of hydrogen bombs. The very essence of destruction, of the rupture of history as we know it, that is the very method by which it deters its ever needing to be used. And this perfectly exemplifies the notion of history or time being over that he talked about, for example, when he was talking about nuclear deterrence. He says, the funny part is that experts have calculated that the state of emergency decreed by an earthquake warning would unleash such a panic that its effects would be greater than the earthquake itself. Here we fall into full derision. Lacking a real catastrophe, it will be easy to unleash a simulated one which will be as good as the first and can even replace it. You wonder if that is not what quote-unquote experts fantasize about. And it is exactly the same case in the nuclear domain. Don't all the preventative and dissuasive systems act like a virtual foci of catastrophe? On the pretense of prevention, they materialize all the consequences in the immediate future. How true it is that we cannot rely on chance to bring on catastrophe. We have to find its programmed equivalent in the preventative measures. It is thus evident that a state or a power sophisticated enough to predict earthquakes and prevent the consequences would constitute a danger to the community and the species much more fantastic than earthquakes themselves. And this is really the post-humanist logic of Baudrillard. Prevention and humanism are the aegis of imminent catastrophe of the symbolic type that is basically being co-opted by a system and which uses dissuasion of an event to effectively materialize the event itself in the form of dissuasion as power. Rather than the power being of that in which events happen, the power is in the hands of the events that don't happen, in the events that have been prevented by the omnipotence of the state or by the omnipotence of the code, as Baudrillard would put it. Finishing off, Baudrillard uses the image of Pompeii as really an effigy of modern life or postmodern life or contemporary life, whatever word you want to use. And he mentions that in Pompeii, everything is metaphysical, including its dreamy geometry, which is not a spatial but mental geometry, labyrinthine. Time seems more harrowingly frozen here than even in the noonday heat. That there's this imminence of catastrophe which seems to transcend time, right? You can go to Pompeii and you can go on these tours where they almost relive the events. They go through the city and they talk about, this is what Pompeii probably would have been like. Here's a mom holding her child as they've been charred together and solidified. And Baudrillard says, here one feels all the heat of death, rendered all the more vivid by the fossilized and fugitive signs of daily life. Wheel ruts in the stone, worn curbs, the petrified wood of a half-open door, the fold of a toga on a body buried beneath the ashes. No history stands between these things and us, like the kind that gives monuments their prestige. They materialize for us here, right now, in the very heat where death caught them. So really, this is a heralding of something that's already come. We typically see heralding of like being a prophet, of talking about something that is yet to come, that is yet to materialize. But in fact, Baudrillard is saying that at this moment where history seems to be progressing, that is the moment where it is regressing into a coded simulacrum, which is this black hole, this pure singularity, this ecstasy of pure and instant communication across the entire world. That the signs of everyday life, and signs basically rule for Baudrillard. We become instrumentalized signs ourselves. The body becomes a sign in a larger discourse, which floats through the void. Things become fossilized, repetitive. I mean, how often does that repetition kick us in the butt in real life of just, oh my gosh, wake up and do the same thing? What is it all moving towards? The world is collapsing. It's like this sense of apathy. And he says that Pompeii is thus a kind of tronc louis, or primary scene, primal scene, the same vertigo of a missing dimension, that of time, the same hallucination of an added dimension, that of the transparency of the slightest details. Like that precise vision of submerged trees living at the bottom of an artificial lake over which you pass while swimming. This is the mental effect of catastrophe, stopping things before they end, thus maintaining them indefinitely in the suspense of their apparition. So, part of the seductive element of catastrophe is that we stop worrying about the notion of the end. After the end of history, of course, end doesn't make any sense anymore. Now it is just about suspense, or secrecy, or seduction. So Baudrillard says, to finish off, we are no longer in the age of grandiose collapses and resurrections, of games of death and eternity, but of little fractal events, smooth annihilations and gradual slides, with no tomorrow from here on, since it is the traces themselves that are erased by this new destiny. This leads us into the horizontal era of events without consequences, the last act being directed by nature herself in a glare of parody. So I hope this has been useful in grasping some of the rather elusive and provocative elements of Baudrillard's philosophy. I think he's one of the most exciting thinkers because you never know whether to believe him or not. You never know, you're trying to think of the political consequences or the social consequences, and one always has to walk on one's tippy toes when reading Baudrillard. I think he is an indispensable thinker. He is someone who is put to the wayside, but I think he definitely represents a radical element of critical theory which you don't have to agree with. I think it's good enough just to read Baudrillard and see what are his strategies. And Baudrillard certainly puts forward these fatal strategies as if they are seemingly all that's left. I think this is a bit of a misstep. I think even within Baudrillard's philosophy, for example, when I mentioned the graffiti artists that he mentions in Symbolic Exchange and Death, I think there are uncoded channels that are left. I think it's a bit utopian in and of itself to imagine a perfectly coded simulacrum. And sometimes I'm unsure whether or not Baudrillard thinks we've gotten there yet. I think sometimes Baudrillard is kind of throwing in the towel, and he's like, okay, well, we don't really have a choice anymore. Basically, all strategies other than fatal strategies are obsolete. But nevertheless, I hope this has been helpful and enlightening, and a very interesting anti-philosophical project in a sense. Check out some of my other lectures I've done on Baudrillard, as well as on other postmodernists. I also do stuff on German idealism and feminist studies and postcolonial studies. Leave any constructive or non-constructive criticism in the comments below, and I'll see you in another lecture.